This time around, it was a little bit different, a teensy-weensy bit bigger. There'd only been, I think, 10,000 people at that 1971 event. This time, there was 120,000, or was it 250,000? Nobody really knows for sure because the fences came down and there was no cow. But I can tell you visually, it was a spectacular thing to behold. And I remember looking out in the gathering, in the gathering doom of evening, and the hills, as far as you could see, as far as the eye could see, were just peopled. And there were banners fluttering in the wind, and it was a bit like, I'd imagine, the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, or, I don't know, some medieval gathering of the tribes. But it had that sense of being a piece of British history. It was quite eerie. Backstage, David was a little bit nervous, but he was excited. He sensed what this was going to be like, and he could see that crowd. He'd had a few concerns earlier during the week about his voice, which had been a little bit tested, but he was good. And as he strode out onto that stage, we could all tell this was going to be a big show. Straight away from the off, China Girl, Changes, Life on Mars, it was hits all the way. And then a little bit of a nod to drum and bass with Little Wonder, new track Space Boy, then Fame, and the crowd were obviously rocking from the first go. And then we came up to Most Amazing Encore, and I remember it was whichever order, it was Heroes, it was Let's Dance, it was Ziggy Stardust, and then there was the I'm Afraid of Americans, a very underrated track, although I gather that President Macron was playing it a couple of weeks ago. Maybe even closer to home today, but moving swiftly on. And as always, David had a really top-notch band, great musicians, and you had the gritty Earl Slick and guitar, that New York vibe, and the very beautiful and delicate Gail Ann Dorsey on vocals and bass, and there was Mark Platy on rhythm, and there was Mr. Campbell doing a sterling job on drums, and there was the lovely Mike Garson, keyboardist. Mike went right the way back to Aladdin Sane with David, and he's really been part of the whole story. And I'd like to take a little second just to talk about Mike. Some of you may know, but he was caught up in that dreadful fire in LA a couple of weeks ago. He lost his house, he lost his studio, he lost all his tapes. I'm sure there's some amazing David material in there. Luckily, he was fine, and I spoke to him last week, and he's a lovely guy for any of you that met him, and all he was wanting to talk about was the outpouring of love and support that he'd had from so many people, and how happy it made him, and really not a thought for his loss, which was a great thing. So great band. I wasn't able to concentrate totally on the concert. I was hidden behind a speaker stack at one stage, having this really intense conversation with Mark Cooper, the head of BBC Music. And Mark, understandably, wanted to broadcast this amazing concert. David, however, had been absolutely adamant. Only 2 songs were to go out, maybe an encore, but he was, he meant what he said. So we were having this dialogue behind the speaker, and I saw Mark talked about this a few weeks ago in the Guardian, very funny interview, and he described the cajoling, the hand-wringing, the pleading, just being met by this sort of amicable, immovable object, which that's one description, I suppose. But he persuaded me to go across the stage during this concert and have a word with David's legendary and long-time PA, and as all of us who know, she was much more than that, Coco Schwab. But I'm afraid the answer was still no, and the BBC reluctantly had to stop broadcasting at that point. Our dialogue carried on forever. But it must be, I should point out at this point, that the actual sound you're going to hear is exactly as it was that day in Glastonbury. There's not been some big multi-truck and dubbing thing going on. It's as it actually was, which is very good. And I remember at the end of the concert seeing David come off stage, and it was almost as if he was in a trance. It was a sort of out-of-body experience, and I think he possibly didn't even know where he was, but he did know that he'd done something quite incredible, and you could feel it everywhere. And let's not yeah, let's not underestimate it. Glastonbury 2000 was an incredible triumph on many, many levels. One of them being that it reminded the world of just who David Bowie was and just how fantastic he was and what his contribution was in terms of music. It was great. But also for David, it galvanised him, and he went on a bit of a musical renaissance. The next album, Heathen, got the best critics he'd had in many years. So it was a great buzz for him. So as we sit here now, about ready to see this great film, which is available, by the way, on Warner's and BBC on November the 30th, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that we're witnessing one of the greatest British artists, and I think maybe the greatest British artist of all time, at the peak of his powers. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Bowie, Glastonbury 2000.